It took just 5 minutes for everything she had built to fall apart. A flight attendant made the worst mistake of her career when she kicked an elderly woman off a plane without realizing who she had just embarrassed. What happened next was a surprise to everyone. Before we start the story, let us know where in the world you're watching from today. If you like stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new one. Of her perfectly ironed uniform as she stood at the entrance to the plane, her polished shoes clicking against the cabin floor. She had been a flight attendant for years, rising through the ranks with strict discipline and a no-nonsense attitude. She believed that those who enforced the rules had authority, and today she was about to make an example of someone who didn't belong. When Margaret Lane stepped onto the plane, she was weak, and her hands were shaking slightly as she grabbed the seatbelts. Her faded coat looked clean and worn, and her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun. Her soft eyes scanned the cabin as if looking for something familiar. She moved slowly, carefully placing each step forward. She wasn't in a hurry like the younger passengers or sure of herself like the frequent travelers, but there was something calm and steady about the way she held herself. Emma barely glanced at her before assuming she was in the wrong place. She had seen it before with older passengers. She stepped forward, her voice clipped and professional, stopping Margaret before she could say anything else. "Ma'am, are you sure you're on the right flight?" Emma asked, though her tone was more of a statement than a question. Margaret gave a small nod, reaching into her coat pocket with careful fingers and pulling out a neatly folded boarding pass. She held it out politely, her voice soft, and said, "I believe I have Cat 2A." Emma took the ticket without even looking. She looked at it and then shook her head. "This is first class," she said, as if she were trying to explain something too hard for the woman to understand. "Economy is further back," she said. Margaret pressed her lips together and tightened her grip on the bag strap. "I have a first-class ticket," she said in a quiet but sure voice. There was a short pause, and some people nearby heard the exchange. Emma forced a smile, her patience wearing thin. "There must be a mistake," she said, handing back the ticket. "First class is for premium passengers." As the moment went on for too long, there was a heavy silence. Emma let out a sharp breath and said, "Ma'am, we don't have time for this. Please step aside so we can begin takeoff procedures." Her tone had changed from polite to firm and patient. Margaret took a slow breath and looked down at her ticket again before looking back up. "I paid for this seat," she repeated. Tensions rose, and some people stopped pretending to look at their phones and turned their attention to the. There was a slight edge to Emma's voice as she said, "I need you to move." Margaret didn't argue, raise her voice, or push back. Instead, she just reached down, grabbed her bag, and gave Emma one last look before walking toward the exit. Emma felt a wave of satisfaction. She had handled the situation quickly, kept things running smoothly, but what she didn't know or couldn't have known was that she would be the one leaving the plane in just 5 minutes. Emma saw Margaret slowly walk toward the exit, holding the strap of her bag with weak hands. The older woman didn't argue, protest, or even look back. Emma saw this as proof that she was right, just another confused passenger who didn't belong in first class. She turned back toward the cabin, adjusting her uniform with a sigh of relief. The boarding process had already taken too long, and now that the problem was solved, they could move on, but something felt off. A low murmur had started. In the first-class cabin, people weren't settling down like they usually did. Some were whispering, while others were moving around uncomfortably in their seats. One man, seated in one of the seats, had stopped moving at all. His hands were folded over his lap, and his face couldn't be read because his jaw was clenched so tightly that a vein pulsed at his temple. Emma thought she recognized him. He was well-dressed, had broad shoulders, and an air of authority that didn't come from just being wealthy. Something about the way he sat made her think of him. As the whispers got louder, a woman in 3A tapped on her husband's arm and pointed toward the jet bridge, where Margaret was being helped by a gate agent. "Did she really just get kicked off?" asked a passenger across the aisle with a frown. "She had a first-class ticket," he said. "I saw it. She wasn't in the wrong." Emma felt irritated because she had seen people get upset over similar situations before. They always thought they knew better and didn't understand how things worked. Rules about how to keep things in order. This was another example of that. She put on a professional smile that barely touched her eyes and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your patience as we prepare for takeoff." She also said, smoothly, "There was a seating issue, but everything is now resolved." The tension in the air did ease when the man in seat C, who hadn't moved since Margaret was kicked off the plane, let out a slow breath and then stood up without saying a word. "Sir, I need you to stay seated," she quickly said, stepping forward. The man didn't even acknowledge her. He turned, walked past her without hesitation, and made his way toward the cockpit. The first officer, who had been out for a short time to check on final preparations, straightened up as soon as he saw him coming. In a voice so calm it sent a chill down Emma's spine, he asked, "Where is the flight captain?" There was a heavy silence in the first-class cabin, and Emma's stomach was twisted into a tight knot. Something was very wrong. The first officer took a deep breath and nodded toward the cockpit door. Her eyes immediately went to the nameplate on the man's blazer, and in an instant, Emma's whole body went cold. It was Daniel Lane's name, a name she had heard before and should have recognized right away, and it wasn't just any passenger's name, it belonged to the CEO of the airline. Emma's heart was beating so fast that she could hear it in her ears, and her throat went dry as Daniel Lane disappeared into the cockpit. Behind him, the whispers among the passengers turned into full-on murmurs, with some exchanging wide-eyed looks and others reaching for their phones at the same time. Emma felt a wave of energy hit her. This wasn't just an uncomfortable situation, it was something much worse. She forced herself to breathe and tightened her grip on the edge of a nearby seat as she tried to think of Daniel Lane, the CEO of the airline, and Margaret Lane, the elderly woman she had just kicked off the plane. She was sick to her stomach because she had just kicked the CEO's mother off a flight. Her legs hurt, but she forced herself to stand tall and smooth the front of her uniform as if that would fix the mess she had just made. Maybe he wouldn't make a scene. Maybe he'd handle this quietly. But deep down, she already knew the truth. In the cockpit, Captain Richard Hayes sat stiffly in his chair, his fingers frozen over the controls. As soon as Daniel Lane entered the air, the small space turned. Captain Lane cautiously straightened up and said, "I didn't know you were on board today." Daniel's face didn't change. He said, "I didn't want special treatment," and his voice was eerily calm. "But now I need to know exactly what just happened on this flight." The captain's jaw tensed. "Sir, I believe there was a misunderstanding with seating assignments on one of our flights." Daniel cut him off with a single raise of his hand. "Don't waste my time," and he demanded, "I want her name." The first officer hesitated. Daniel's voice didn't rise, but it didn't need to because the captain swallowed Emma Carter. Sir Daniel nodded once, as if to lock that name into his mind. Then he slowly let out a breath and reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. With a few quick taps, he sent a single message back to the cabin. Emma's phone buzzed in her pocket. At first, she ignored it because she had more important things to worry about. But then she felt it buzzing again and again, and when she finally pulled it out, she caught her breath because she saw the message on the crew's communication system. Emma Carter was relieved of duty and removed from the flight right away, according to a message sent directly from executive headquarters. Emma's stomach dropped so fast that she felt like she was in free fall. Passengers were still watching and waiting, sensing something was wrong but not fully understanding how bad it was. She forced herself to move quickly toward the cockpit door, saying she had to fix this and explain what was going on, but as she reached for the handle, the door swung open, letting Daniel Lane out. Emma finally understood when his cold eyes locked onto hers that this wasn't just a warning, it was the end of her career. As Daniel Lane stepped forward, his cold, unwavering gaze locked onto her. The noise level in the cabin rose, and some passengers leaned in to listen. Others angled their phones subtly, pretending to check notifications but probably recording everything. The tension was unbearable, and Emma forced a polite, professional smile even as panic tore at her chest as she opened her mouth to explain. Daniel spoke first, "Miss Carter." He asked her in a calm, measured voice that sent a chill down her spine. "Do you understand what you've just done?" Emma's fingers twitched at her sides. "Sir, there was a misunderstanding. I was simply following protocol." Daniel let out a quiet breath and shook his head slightly. "Protocol." His tone was almost amused, but there was no humor in his eyes. "Tell me, Miss Carter," he said, "what protocol says that a first-class ticketed passenger should be taken off a flight?" Emma swallowed hard. Daniel's face didn't change, and the words, "Did you bother to check before humiliating my mother in front of the whole plane?" hit her like a slap. More people on the plane started staring at her, some with wide eyes and others shaking their heads. Emma struggled to keep her voice steady. "Sir, I assure you I never meant any disrespect," and Daniel's voice was sharp and final. Emma's breath caught. "You didn't just disrespect her," and Daniel continued, his voice lowering slightly. "You snubbed her, put her down, and made assumptions about her based on nothing but your own haughtiness." Emma felt her stomach twist violently. Daniel looked at his watch and then turned to Captain Hayes, who was standing behind him and looking more tense than ever. 8 minutes, sir," Hayes said quickly. "That gives you just enough time to get your things together and get off this flight." Emma's breath stopped short. "Wait," she said. Quickly stepping forward, "Mr. Lane," I said, "I've worked for this airline for years. There was a misunderstanding. If I had known, you didn't bother to tell me, and because of that, you no longer work for this airline." Daniel's eyes were as cold as steel, and Emma's stomach dropped. The finality of his words made her sweat, and she clenched her fists in anger. "That's not fair," she yelled before she could stop herself. "I was just doing my job." Daniel tilted his head a little and let her go. "If I may be clear, Miss Carter, your job was to serve and help passengers, not to judge who should be in first class." Emma felt like everyone in the cabin was looking at her. Daniel looked at the gate agent standing near the entrance and said, "Get another flight attendant up here to replace her." Emma's heart sank. This couldn't be happening. But before she could say anything else, another crew member stepped forward from the galley. She recognized Hatter, someone newer. Hannah hesitated, looking back and forth between Emma and Daniel before stepping up to take her place at the front of the cabin. Emma's face burned. They had already replaced her. People were whispering, some nodding in agreement, others just watching the spectacle unfold. This was humiliation, this was punishment, and worst of all, it was just the beginning. The cabin was so quiet that even the sound of a passenger shifting in their seat was so loud that it made her body feel like it was frozen in place. Then it hit her like a tidal wave. She had been fired right in front of everyone. Her legs hurt, but she forced herself to stand tall. "Mr. Lane," she tried again, this time with a voice that was a little unsteady but still full of the authority she had always had. "I have worked for this airline for years and have followed every rule, enforced every policy, and upheld the highest standards." Daniel raised his hand. "Yet in all those years, you never learned the most important lesson." Respect, he said, his voice steady but sharp, not just for the rules, not just for the procedures, but for the people you claim to serve. She felt the weight of his words like a stone on her chest. She had always been proud of her authority and how well she ran her flights, but now she was standing in front of the CEO and passengers watching her fall. People were talking about her again, but this time it wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was clear to everyone that she was the bad guy on this flight. The captain cleared his throat and said, "Miss Carter, I need you to step aside so we can proceed with takeoff." Emma's throat tightened as she heard those words. Step aside. She felt like she was being erased and thrown away like she was nothing. She looked around the crew for someone to stand up for her, but no one moved or spoke. Her eyes fell on Heather, a young woman. Heather, the flight attendant who had taken her place, gave her a hesitant, sorry look before lowering her gaze. Emma's stomach churned as Daniel sighed and adjusted the cuff of his blazer before saying again, "Miss Carter, I will repeat myself. You are relieved of duty. You will leave this plane now." The way he said it was so calm and final that it was like she wasn't even worth his time anymore. Heat rushed to her face as she felt a mix of shame and embarrassment. Fear and desperation. If she left this plane, she would lose her job, her reputation, and everything she had worked for. She forced a tight smile, holding on to the last bit of control she had left. "I know you're upset, sir. Maybe we can talk about this after the flight." Daniel's eyes darkened. "There is nothing to talk about." Emma opened her mouth again, ready to fight, ready to do anything to stop this from happening. But before she could say another word, two uniformed security officers walked through the door. Her stomach dropped. She didn't need anyone to tell her. She realized she wasn't just being fired, she was being let off the plane. The realization hit her like a suffocating weight, along with the gas from the other passengers, the low hum of people whispering, and the barely concealed smirks of those who had seen everything. It was all too much for Emma. Her vision blurred for a second, and her breath came in uneven bursts. This wasn't just a punishment, she was being executed in public, and she had nowhere to run. They stood near the doorway, sending a message that there was no more room for discussion. She was leaving the plane, whether she wanted to or not. She could hear strange noises in her ears, drowning out the passengers' conversations. She knew they were watching, waiting for her to lose her cool and fight back. Some were laughing and enjoying the show, while others were shaking their heads and talking about how quickly things had got out of control. Emma could feel the walls closing in on her. She had spent years trying to get through this. She had been in charge of making sure everyone followed the rules, but now she was being taken away. Her mouth felt dry, but she sucked down her pride and tried one more time, "Mr. Lame. I think we can both agree that this situation got out of hand," she said with a shy smile, her fingers shaking. "I would never intentionally disrespect a passenger, especially not someone as important as your mother." She took full responsibility for the misunderstanding, but she thought Daniel didn't blink. She kept trying to keep her voice steady. "I have been a dedicated employee for over 10 years. My record speaks for itself. I have upheld this airline standards with nothing but professionalism." Daniel sighed and shook his head slightly as he looked at her, but there was no sympathy in his expression. "Professionalism," he repeated, almost amused. He turned to look at the first-class passengers and asked, "Miss Carter, do you think they saw professionalism when—" Emma flinched, and he let the silence between them grow, forcing her to take in what he was saying. "You call this an overreaction," he continued. "I call this accountability." Emma's breath caught, and he stepped closer, lowering his voice just a bit. But that made what he was saying even more harsh. "You spend years enforcing the rules, making passengers feel small when they made a mistake, using your position to assert dominance instead of provide service. Now you're the one on the other end of the phone. Sighed, how does it feel? The words hit Emma like a slap, and things were getting worse by the second. She was expecting anger, frustration, maybe even legal action, but not this level of humiliation. She tried again, this time with a quieter voice that was almost pleading. I know I made a mistake. Daniel gave her a long, measured look and said, no, you don't. If you did, you wouldn't be standing here trying to negotiate your way out of it. Emma could feel the air leaving her lungs. She had no more arguments left. He wasn't going to change his mind. One of the security guards walked forward and said, Miss Carter, we need you to collect your belongings. Emma's hands were clenched into fists at her sides, holding her things as if she were just another passenger being asked to leave. When she realized what was really going on, her stomach started to churn as she turned toward the small storage area for flight attendants, where her bag was neatly tucked away with the other crew's things. She reached for it, but her fingers were stiff, and her movements. As she turned back to the cabin, she tightened her grip on the strap as she took in the scene. People were staring at her. Some pretended to look at their phones, but she knew they were recording. This wasn't just a private firing, it was a public disgrace. Her heart raced as she realized something even worse. She wasn't just about to lose her job. Her face would be all over the internet tomorrow with the words "flight attendant" written next to her name. People would share it, comment on it, and laugh at her because she was an embarrassment. Her hands felt icy cold as she forced herself to move toward the exit. The security guards didn't touch her or force her, but their presence was enough. She stepped toward the open door, feeling the heat of shame rise in her chest as she passed by the first-class cabin. That's when she saw Margaret Lane sitting quietly in her wheelchair near the jet bridge, her small hands resting on her lap. Emma was escorted off the plane in the same way she had been a few minutes before, but there was no smugness or triumph in her eyes, only disappointment, which was worse. Emma's breath stuttered. She had spent the last few minutes desperately fighting for her job, her pride, her career, but she had never once apologized to the woman she had embarrassed, and now it was too late. Daniel Lane's voice rang behind her, sealing her fate with a chilling finality. Miss Carter, he said. Emma stepped over the threshold and felt the weight of every passenger's stare pressing into her back. The doors then closed behind her, and her career was over. Emma barely heard the door seal shut behind her. The soft click echoed in her ears, marking the end of an era. The cool air from the jet bridge was a stark contrast to the suffocating tension she had just left behind in the cabin. Each step forward felt heavier than the last, and her grip on the handlebars became weak. Tightening around the handle of her bag, she forced herself to keep walking. She didn't know where she was supposed to go, but security wasn't dragging her either. The shame of being seen pushed her forward step by painful step as she followed the narrow corridor that led back into the airport terminal. People in the waiting area were still talking and checking their phones, unaware of the storm going on inside her, but as she stepped off the jet bridge, she saw a few heads turn. Some people had seen her take Margaret off the plane just minutes before they were now watching her. Emma felt her chest tighten when she saw Margaret Lonnie still sitting in her wheelchair near the gate. She was talking softly to a staff member, her voice calm and unreadable, but she couldn't take her eyes off of Margaret. For a moment, everything else disappeared. The older woman's look wasn't cold or triumphant, it was just disappointed. That one look broke down any defenses Emma had left. She had spent her whole career thinking she knew best and had the power to tell who deserved what, but now she was standing in front of the woman she had wronged and felt small. She opened her mouth to apologize, but nothing came out. What was she supposed to say? How could an apology fix what had just happened? Margaret didn't wait for her to figure it out, she just gave her a slow nod and then turned her attention back to the airline staff as if Emma didn't exist, which maybe she didn't in the world of aviation. Emma barely noticed the airline supervisor walking up to her, a young woman in a neatly pressed navy blue suit holding a company-issued tablet against her chest. "Miss Carter," the supervisor asked, though it wasn't really a question. Emma forced herself to look at her, and yes, the supervisor's fingers moved across the tablet screen as she spoke, as required by executive. Emma's stomach twisted violently. "You are no longer employed by this airline. You are required to return all company-issued property, including your uniform ID badge and access credentials." The supervisor's eyes barely flickered. "Yes, a security officer will escort you to the crew lounge where you can change out of your uniform. Once that's done, you will be escorted off the premises." Emma took a sharp breath into her nose. "Is there going to be," she asked, "some kind of review of formal?" Hearing the supervisor's lips pressed together in a way that looked like pity, Mr. Lane had already made his decision, so there would be no hearing. Emma's hand started to shake, and she clenched her jaw to stand up straighter. "I'll need a letter of termination," she said. The supervisor nodded, already expecting the request. "It's been sent to your company email, your employee file has been updated, and your access to all airline systems has been revoked." A cold chill ran down Emma's spine. They had wiped her out so quickly. The news hit her like a ton of bricks. She wasn't just fired, she was erased. Her employee number would no longer exist in the system, and her name would be flagged in HR databases across all major airlines if she tried to apply for another job in the industry. This would follow her everywhere. Her breath quickened as Miss Carter, the supervisor, said, "This way, please." Emma led her toward the crew lounge like a prisoner walking to their execution. The airport, which she had confidently moved through for years, now felt like hostile territory. She passed other crew members, including pilots, flight attendants, and ground staff. Some recognized her, but others only gave her a quick glance before whispering to each other as soon as she was out of earshot. The walk to the crew lounge felt like a public humiliation parade by the time she got there, where she found a nearly empty room with a few flight attendants enjoying coffee. As she walked in, everyone stopped what they were doing. A young flight attendant named Laura, who Emma had worked with on several flights, blinked in surprise. Emma didn't answer, she couldn't. She moved toward the lockers, her fingers fumbling as she entered her passcode on the small keypad. The lock didn't click open, her access had already been revoked, and her own locker wouldn't open for her anymore. The lump formed in her throat as she turned to the supervisor standing nearby. The woman sighed and tapped a few things on her tablet before remotely unlocking the locker. Emma quickly grabbed her extra clothes from the top shelf, forcing her shaking hands to move. She didn't look at anyone because she didn't want to see their faces. She walked into the changing room and locked the door behind her. She stood there for a long time, her flight attendant uniform, which had once given her power and pride, now making her feel suffocated with stiff robotic movements. She took her name badge off. She shook as she took off the bright navy blue blazer, untied the silk scarf around her neck, and changed into the plain clothes she had worn to the airport that morning. When she looked at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. She wasn't Emma Carter, senior flight attendant anymore. She was just Emma, and she had never felt so small. A sharp knock at the door made her flinch. "Miss Carter, the chief of security." The supervisor called out, "We need your uniform." Emma took one last shaky breath before unlocking the door and walking out. She handed over the neatly folded uniform, badge, and employee ID, everything that the supervisor could use to find her. The supervisor took it without showing any emotion and then nodded to the waiting security officer to lead her to the exit. Emma realized that she had lost more than just her job. She had lost her power, her reputation, and her career. She wasn't just being fired from the airline, she was being erased from history. There was nothing left for Emma to hold on to, so she didn't say a word as she followed the security officer out of the crew lounge. The world around her seemed far away, like she was walking through fog. The area she had marched down with authority now felt like foreign land. She had walked through this airport thousands of times, leading her crew and enforcing rules with complete competence, but now she felt like she was just another person being led out every step of the way. There was no going back, no last-minute reprieve, and no way to undo what had already been done. Emma's job, reputation, and career were all over in less than an hour. As she walked up the stairs, she could feel the energy from crew members who had heard whispers about what had happened and from passengers who had seen her fall. The terminal was busy with people rushing to catch flights, families reuniting, and workers going about their daily lives, but for Emma, everything was over. When she finally got to the main exit, her throat was dry, and the security guard standing next to her had a neutral face. He wasn't sad or mean, he was just getting things done. "Miss Carter," he said, stopping just before the sliding doors that led to the outside world, "this is where we part ways." Emma could feel her heart beating fast against her ribs. "That's it?" she asked. "Your termination has been processed, and you are no longer authorized to enter any employee-designated areas of this." The security guard hesitated for a moment as if he wanted to say more, and then after a long pause, he spoke, "I'd suggest finding another line of work." He said this quietly, and Emma felt sick to her stomach again. She didn't need to be told this, she already knew it. She tightened her grip on her bag strap, but her hands were shaking, and if I tried to appeal, she threw me out. The officer didn't laugh, smirk, or even look surprised by the situation. He shook his head and said, "Miss Carter, Mr. Lane has made that clear." This made her heart drop. She had spent years enforcing airline rules, thinking that as long as she did what she was supposed to do, she would be safe. But now she realized something. There was no rule that could protect her from this. It wasn't just about what she did today. It was about who she did it to. Daniel Lane wasn't just the CEO of the airline, he was one of the most powerful men in the aviation industry. He made sure she would never work for an airline again, more than any employee handbook, corporate policy, or internal review. Emma took a slow, shaky breath as the security guard pointed her toward the exit and said, "Take care, Miss Carter." She stepped forward, her feet moving almost automatically as she pushed through the glass doors and into the open air. As soon as she stepped outside, the noise of the airport changed, with the hum of jet engines and the rush of taxis pulling up to pick her up. The sound of travelers yelling for rides hit her all at once. She had walked out these doors many times before after long flights, stressful layovers, and long shifts, but this time she wasn't coming back. Her breath was uneven as she reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. There were no missed calls, no messages, and no one reaching out. Her contacts list felt empty. Pilots, flight attendants, supervisors, and people she had worked with for years wouldn't return her calls. They wouldn't risk their jobs to defend her, even if they felt bad for her. Suddenly, a horrifying thought crossed her mind. She opened her email app and scrolled through it, her fingers shaking as she did so. There it was, a formal notice from the airline's HR department explaining her termination. The words "conduct violation" were bolded in the first paragraph, but that wasn't what made her stomach drop. At the bottom of the email, there was an attachment, a flag designation in her employee file. Emma's vision blurred, but she knew what that meant. She knew this because she had seen it happen to other employees. When an employee was flagged for a major violation, that black mark followed them not only within the company but also across the entire aviation industry. Emma took a deep breath and started scrolling through her messages, desperately looking for someone who could help her. she tacked on. She tried to call an old boss she used to be close with and who had promised to stand by her no matter what. The phone rang twice, but went straight to voicemail. She tried again and again, but nothing came up. She wasn't fired, she was erased. She put down the phone, her breath coming in short, uneven bursts. For years, she had been the one enforcing rules, controlling flights, and deciding who belonged where. Now, she didn't belong anywhere. She clenched her hands around the phone as she stood at the curb and watched taxis pull up one by one. A mother and daughter laughed as they loaded their bags into the back seat of one car, and a businessman in a suit adjusted his tie before getting into another. Life was going well for everyone except Emma. She had thought for a long time that power came from following the rules, but real power came from people who could take it all away in an instant. She had never been untouchable, she had just never been tested, and now she had lost everything. Emma took a deep, shaky breath. Emma stood still at the curb, staring at the long road ahead. She had no job, no future in the industry, and no idea where to go next. For the first time in her life, she wasn't in charge, she was just another person waiting for a ride that wasn't coming. The cold reality of her situation hit her like a blanket, and she couldn't bring herself to put her phone away. She kept staring at the dark screen as if she was hoping it would light up, as if someone would call her offer. Lifeline to tell her that everything was just a big mistake, but there was no call, message, or last-minute redemption. She had spent years working as an airline employee, rising through the ranks and believing that her authority made her untouchable. But in less than an hour, she was gone, like she had never been. She clenched her jaw and forced herself to move, taking slow, robotic steps toward the taxi line. Everything about this moment felt wrong. She had always left the airport in uniform, walking with her head held high. After getting ready for her next flight, she felt like a stranger in a place that had once been hers. Her steps slowed when she saw a small group of flight attendants standing near the employee entrance. She recognized them right away, co-workers she had worked with, people she had trained, and people who had once looked up to her. Her stomach turned as their eyes met for a moment, and she hoped that someone would step forward and ask her if she was okay, offer her support, or remind her that she was. They weren't completely alone, they just stood there and looked at her, some with sympathy and others with interest. But none of them moved toward her or spoke up. They didn't have to, she already knew what they were thinking. They had already moved away. No one wanted to be seen with someone who had just been fired by the CEO. Her throat tightened, and she forced herself to turn away, pretending she hadn't seen them. Keep walking, don't let them see you break. She reached the taxi stand, gripping there. The strap of her bag was so tight that her knuckles turned white. A car pulled up, and the driver barely glanced at her before rolling down the window and asking in a bored tone, "Where to?" Emma hesitated for the first time in years. She didn't know where she was supposed to go, her apartment, which she hadn't spent much time in because she was always flying, a hotel, a friend's house. She had spent her whole life living for her career, shaping every part of herself around her job, her position, and her authority. She had no life outside of work. It was the only thing she could think of to say. She swallowed the lump in her throat and finally forced out the name of her apartment complex. The driver didn't ask any questions. He just nodded, put the car in gear, and pulled away from the curb. As the airport faded behind her, Emma kept her eyes on the window and watched the terminal get farther away. It was strange that she had spent so many years in that airport watching people come and go, sending them off to different places, always knowing that she would be back the next day ready to do it all over again, but not this time. She wasn't going to come back ever. A small tremor ran through her hands, and she clenched them into fists to stop it. She wasn't going to cry, not now, not here. She had spent years being in charge, setting the rules, and making the decisions, so she wasn't going to break down like a helpless child. But that a soft ding from her phone broke the silence. She looked down at the screen, and her heart rate went up for a split second. It was a message. Maybe someone. That person was trying to reach out. Maybe there was still a chance, but when she opened it, her stomach dropped. It wasn't a message from a friend or a text from a coworker checking in. It was a news alert. As she read the headline, "Flight attendant kicks elderly woman off plane and fires her in front of passengers in brutal confrontation with CEO," her heart slammed against her ribs. She held her breath as she tapped the link to open the article. Reporters had already heard from passengers, and some had even written statements detailing every humiliating moment of her fall, including the slack of karma, the CEO's cruel decision, the security guard, and at the end of the article, a video of her violently twisting her stomach. She knew what it would be like from the moment Daniel Lane asked for her to be removed to the moment the security guard stepped forward and she was forced to gather her desires and leave the. She closed her eyes for a split second, determined not to see, but she did, and it was even worse than she had imagined. The angle wasn't perfect, but it was good enough to see the shocked look on her face when she realized who Margaret Lane was, as well as the passengers whispering and smirking, and it was good enough to see her walking out with her head down, no longer in charge. She scrolled down and quickly read the comments. It was brutally good. She got exactly what she deserved. That CEO is a legend for. I love how she was just wiped out of the industry. Emma's vision was blurry. The video had hundreds of comments and thousands of views. This wasn't just the end of her job, it was a public execution. She threw her phone on the seat next to her, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Her career wasn't over, her name was ruined. She could already see what was coming. Employers wouldn't just see that she was fired in an internal airline database, they would see this video. Would see the headlines. She went from being a respected flight attendant to a viral disaster. The car jolted slightly as it hit a bump, waking her up. She had to think, she had to come up with a plan, but as she stared out the window at the city for the first time in her life, she had no idea what to do. She had no job, no future, and no way out of what she had done, and worst of all, everyone was watching. The ride felt endless, and the city blurred by Emma as she sat stiffly in the back seat, spiraling with the weight of everything that had happened. The only sound was the soft hum of the radio, but she wasn't listening. All she could hear was her own heartbeat. Her phone was still face up on the seat next to her. The screen was dim, but she knew that with one touch she'd see it all again, the comments, the headlines, the video. She should have put the phone away, turned it off, and ignored the growing chaos outside the car, but she couldn't. Shaky hands hovered over the device before finally picking it up again. The video was all over the internet. She opened another article and then another news outlet that was already running the story. The details weren't even exaggerated because the truth was so bad. Senior flight attendant Emma Carter was fired after kicking an elderly passenger out of first class. The powerful airline CEO delivered swift justice after a flight attendant embarrassed his mother. A passenger caught the moment the flight attendant was fired in real time. The worst one, this is what happens when you think you're better than the passengers. Her stomach twisted violently. The world wasn't just watching her fall, they were celebrating it. The video had gone viral, and people who had never met her, worked with her, or even known her name before today were tearing her apart in the comments. Some were laughing, others were angry, and some were making fun of her like she was just a cautionary tale. She had spent years building a career in aviation thinking that her experience would help her get ahead. It didn't matter anymore that she was a joke, a lesson on what happens when you abuse power, a headline to be shared across social media, analyzed in articles, and torn apart in the comments, and she couldn't stop it. The car jerked slightly as it stopped at a red light, and Emma realized her breathing had become uneven. Her hands were clenched around her phone so tightly that her knuckles were turning white. She forced herself to take a deep breath through her nose to try to get back to normal. For so many years, she had lived by a simple rule: be in charge or be overruled. She had trained herself to be firm, unwavering, and respected, because she thought that as long as she stayed strict and disciplined in control, she would always be on top. But now she was nothing and nobody, a disgraced worker who had been fired from the industry in real time. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She needed to call someone. She scrolled through her contacts again. Her heart was racing. Supervisors wouldn't talk to this old co-worker because they had already grown apart. She tried one last name, Victoria Hale. It was a former flight supervisor who had been Emma's mentor and told her she had potential. Victoria's thumb hovered over the call button for a long second before she pressed it. The phone rang 3 times, then stopped. Emma's breath caught in her throat as Victoria picked up the phone. "Victoria, it's me." Emma swallowed and said, "I know you've probably seen what happened, but Victoria's voice was carefully neutral, not angry or sympathetic, just flat. Emma's heart was pounding in her ears as she whispered, "Please, you know this isn't how I normally handle things. I made a mistake. I know that. But I need help. I need you to move on." Victoria's voice had a note of finality in it this time. "I'm sorry," she said. "Your name is already flagged across every major airline. There's nothing I can do for you. Victoria, please, you have connections. Maybe if I just explain my side, Emma will get it." Victoria sighed. "Emma, you don't get it." Victoria continued, "Fact is, even if I wanted to help, it wouldn't change anything. Your name is toxic." After a moment, "I know this is hard," Victoria said, "but the best advice I can give you is to start looking at other careers because aviation, the pause, is done with you." Emma's grip on the phone loosened, and her hand shook violently. Victoria's voice softened just a bit. "I'm sorry, Emma. I really am." The call ended, and Emma stared blankly at the screen, her mind racing. Was this it? Was this her last chance? Was this her last possible lifeline? The car started moving again, and the city rushed past her in a blur, but Emma didn't see any of it. She had never really thought that this was permanent. She had. Maybe there was a way to fix it. Maybe she could talk her way out of it, make the right connections, and show that she wasn't as bad as the news made her out to be. But the truth was worse than she ever imagined. She wasn't just fired or erased, she had been sent away, and everything she had worked for was gone. The car pulled up in front of her apartment building, but Emma barely noticed it. "That'll be $32.50, the driver said, sounding uninterested. Emma moved stiffly, took cash from her wallet, and handed it over. Emma didn't want to count them, she just wanted to get out of the car and onto the sidewalk. As she did, she felt the full weight of everything fall on her. For years, she had lived for her career, but now she had nothing. She wasn't just unemployed, she was unhireable, a walking scandal, and the worst part was that everyone had already moved on. She was completely and utterly alone. Emma stood on the sidewalk outside her apartment building, feeling like her body didn't belong to her anymore. She had spent the whole ride here trying to. She tried to figure out what had happened, but as she stood in front of her door, she realized she had nowhere else to go. For years, her apartment had been nothing more than a stopover, the place she went between flights, a place she barely lived in because her real life was always in the air. It had never felt like home, but now it was all she had left. Her fingers shook as she reached into her bag for her keys and fumbled with them before shoving one into the lock. As she walked inside, she felt the crushing silence. There was no warm welcome or familiar comfort, just empty space. The blinds were closed, casting faint lines of light across the floor, and the air inside still smelled musty like a place that had been left empty for a long time. She had been everywhere else that she had forgotten what it was like to be stuck here. She threw her bag on the floor and kicked off her shoes, barely making it to the couch before her legs gave out. For the first time since the nightmare began, she let herself feel the weight and finality of it. She wasn't just fired, she was ruined. She knew she should turn off her phone, throw it across the room, or do something else, but her fingers hit the screen before she could stop themselves. The video had now trickled in views, and the top comment said, "This woman really thought she was untouchable. Look at her face when she realizes she's done." She scrolled. "You love to see karma in action. She deserved worse, tbh." Emma's breath caught as she saw thousands of comments from strangers ripping her. People were right when they said she was cocky and treated passengers like they were beneath her. She built her career on being in charge, following the rules to the letter, and making sure everyone knew their place. But when she was at the bottom, no one fought for her or spoke up because they had been waiting for this moment. Emma clenched her jaw and forced herself to breathe. She could let this destroy her, or she could fight. Emma hadn't been the type to give up easily, and she wasn't going to start now that she opened her laptop and felt her heart race. If the airline industry wanted her gone, that was fine, and if people wanted to drag her name through the mud, that was fine, too. But she wasn't going to disappear. She started typing faster because now that her name was out there, everyone was watching, and maybe it was time to take charge of her own story. Emma had spent the last few hours watching herself be. Reading comments on the internet from strangers who had already decided she was the worst person in the world, and for the first time in her life, she had no control over it. This realization hit her harder than she thought it would. She had spent years thinking that power came from following rules, keeping things in order, and making sure everyone stayed in their place. She had built her career on structure, policies, and making sure people respected authority. But now she had no authority, no voice. She was just a mess. People who didn't know her or care about who she was before this dragged her name through the mud, and no matter how many times she thought about what had happened, she couldn't get away from one fact: she had done this to herself. The world hadn't turned against her for no reason. The passengers who had seen her embarrass Margaret Lane had kept quiet because they didn't care about her, and the flight crew she had worked with for years hadn't defended her because they didn't want to. Victoria, the only person in the industry she had ever trusted, made it clear that Emma Carter couldn't take it back. Emma Carter let out a shaky breath and forced herself to sit back down. Her laptop screen lit up, and the cursor blinking, waiting for her to type something. But she had no idea where to begin. She had built her whole life around one thing: her job. Now that she didn't have one, she had no backup plan, no other skill set, and nothing outside of the airline industry. Nothing she had worked for had been taken away in less than an hour, making her stomach turn at the thought of what she needed to do. She reached for her phone and opened a new message. She hovered over the keyboard before typing the name Ethan Matthews. She hesitated. Ethan was one of the few pilots she had worked well with. He wasn't a friend, but he was always neutral and never got involved in gossip or drama. He had worked for the airline for years and, unlike her, had a reputation. Clean. If anyone could help her, maybe it was him. Her hand shook a little as she typed the message. "Hey Ethan, I know you've probably seen everything, but I need to ask you something. Can you talk?" She stared at the message for a long time before hitting send. She waited 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and 15 seconds, but nothing came back. Her stomach dropped. She didn't know if Ethan had seen the message or if he was ignoring it. Maybe he had already decided to stay away from her, just like everyone else. Her chest tightened, and she threw her phone onto the ground. She jumped up quickly from the couch because she needed some fresh air. She grabbed her keys and stormed out of her apartment into the cold night air. The streets were empty except for a few cars and the sound of voices talking far away. As she walked, her arms were crossed over her chest. She couldn't just sit there and let this happen to her. She had to find a way to fix it. But how could she when everyone already knew who she was? As she walked, her thoughts went crazy. Daniel Lane's attitude toward her on the plane, treating her like she was nothing, was what ended her career, and she was the one who made it possible. She was so focused on being right and enforcing her authority that she hadn't even stopped to think about the person in front of her. She had spent years treating passengers like they were beneath her, and now she was the one being looked down upon. Her pride had put her in this position, and no one wanted to talk to her about it. No one wanted to defend her anymore, and she was starting to understand why her steps slowed as she reached the edge of the block and her breath came out in uneven puffs. Was this who she was? Someone who spent years enforcing rules without compassion? Someone who looked at people and only saw their seat assignments, boarding groups, and flight status, never their actual humanity? She had built her whole life on authority, thinking that she deserved it. Emma stood on the street corner, feeling the cold air bite her skin as the weight of everything finally settled deep in her bones. She wasn't just unemployed, she was now a nobody. For so long, she had thought that respect came with authority, that as long as she followed the rules, enforced the policies, and kept passengers in check, she was doing the right thing. She had been strict because she thought it was necessary. She thought that being in charge would lead to respect. The truth was that she had been replaceable the whole time. The airline had erased her in less than an hour, with no hearing, no second chances, and no redemption. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she quickly clenched her hands before slowly pulling it out. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw Ethan Mackey's name on the screen. For a moment, she just stared at it. She had half expected him to ignore her message completely, or maybe he had been thinking about whether or not to respond. Despite being told to stay away from her and keep his distance, he answered. Emma's thumb hovered over the screen before she finally swiped to open the message. Ethan, I saw the news. What do you want, Emma? She had a lump in her throat because she didn't know what to say. What did she want? Her job back, which was impossible, a second chance, someone to tell her it wasn't as bad as it seemed, it was worse. She hesitated before typing, Emma, I don't know where to go from here. She hated how weak it sounded, but it was the truth. 3 tiny dots showed up almost instantly, showing that he was typing. The message then came through, Ethan, Emma, you don't fix something like this, you start over. She had never thought about starting over, maybe getting a new job or flying with a different airline in the future, because starting over meant admitting she had lost her fingers. Emma, you think I don't know that, but how were the airline blacklisted me? Every airline will see my name and drop my resume in the trash. You think I can just apply for a desk job? His response came just as quickly, Ethan, what are you going to do? You're just going to sit in your apartment and wait for people to forget. That's not how this works, Emma. No one is going to forget. Those words hit her like a punch to the gut. No one is going to forget. That was the worst part. She could handle losing her job, being embarrassed, and even people turning their backs on her, but the world wouldn't let this go away. Her name was already all over every social media site. Someone she had never met, spoken to, or been wronged in any way was already judging her and laughing at her. It didn't matter if she deleted her accounts, the damage was already done. She wasn't just losing her job, she was losing her whole identity. Her fingers shook as she typed, Emma, what do I do? What would you do if you were me? This time, Ethan took longer to reply. and she imagined him sitting there debating whether he even wanted to waste his time talking to her. Finally, she told him, "Ethan, you have two options. You can disappear or you can own it." Emma frowned and typed back, "Own it." Her heart was racing as she spoke. "What do you mean, own what?" she asked. "My life is over. The airline industry won't touch me. No company is going to hire me after what happened. My face is everywhere. I'm a joke." There was a long pause, and she bit her lip and stared at the screen, waiting. "Ethan, that's exactly why you need to own it right now. The internet controls your story. You need to take it back." Emma's breath caught. Take it back, she thought. I hadn't thought about that. I was too focused on. There was no way she could hide until this was over. People would remember her, so what if she changed how they saw her instead of hiding? Her hand shook as she typed her next message. "Emma, you're saying I should talk about it, defend myself? That'll just make it worse. Ethan, not defend yourself. Be honest, tell your story before they tell it for you." She wondered if she could do that and if anyone would listen or if it would only give them more evidence. As she stared at Ethan's words, "Take it back." She had spent her whole career thinking she was in charge and had lost that power when Daniel Lane called security. But maybe, just maybe, she could get it back. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, her heart racing, and she started typing for the first time since this nightmare began. Emma's fingers flew over the keyboard, her mind racing faster than she could process the thought that she had been in charge for years and had power over an entire company. She used to tell the passengers where to sit, who had to follow the rules, and who got special treatment. Now she was on the other side, and for the first time she wasn't enforcing a story, she was becoming one. She started writing what could either save her or kill her. She had two options. She could let the world tell her story and let the viral headlines define her forever, or she could own it. Her hands shook as she typed, "I was fired," in front of a whole plane of passengers. Although she paused, she continued, "I thought that being strict meant being respected. I thought that enforcing the rules meant I was doing my job. I never stopped to realize that my job wasn't about control. It was about service. I was fired because I embarrassed a passenger who deserved kindness, a passenger who did nothing wrong, and I have no one to blame but myself." She took a deep breath and forced herself to type the next words. "I could sit here and tell you. You could say I was following company policy as an excuse, but the truth is I didn't see her as a person. I saw her as a problem that needed to be fixed, and that's why I lost everything." She clenched her fists. She had never admitted she was wrong before, not like this. She kept typing, the words coming out faster than she could think. "I don't expect sympathy or forgiveness, but I do want to be honest because the internet has already told my story. I want to tell it again." As she finished, her stomach was in knots as she read the words. Was this the right thing to do? Would it even work, or would it make things worse? Her thumb hovered over the post button, her heart was racing, and she pressed it. Emma didn't move. Her heart felt like it had stopped beating altogether as she watched the post go live for a moment. Then the likes and comments started coming in, some of which were mean, "Too little, too late. No one cares about your apology. You ruined your own life." Mixed in with the hate, something unexpected showed up. She admitted it. Most people wouldn't have, which was refreshing. Everyone always tries to make excuses, but she's taking full responsibility. That's pretty crazy. She's literally owning up to everything. Emma caught her breath. That was respect. It was small, it wasn't much, but for the first time since this nightmare began, someone wasn't just tearing her apart. She refreshed the page. Some people still hated her and wanted her to go, but others were listening. She didn't have a job or a career and didn't know what to do next, but maybe she had done something important. She had taken back her story, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't running from the consequences, she was facing them. That's the end of the story, but I want to hear from you. Do you think she deserved what happened? Let me know in the comments below, and if you like this video, don't forget to please like, follow, and turn on alerts so you never miss a new story. Thanks for watching.